Alright, welcome to this week's lesson. So we are going to be starting Life of Pi. So for some reason, somebody told me to give you guys the novel before school got out. So most of you have the novel. I think there were 3 copies on my desk when I left school of students who were absent. So if you did not have a copy or you forgot yours at school, you can do a quick search online, Life of Pi full text. There are several places where you can get it. My dog is behind me. Um, so if you're having trouble finding a PDF, let me know that works for you. You can do Google searches and find one that works on whatever device you have. So Life of Pi, a little bit about the author. So he was born relatively recently, 1963, compared to some of the authors that we've read. He traveled a lot, and you'll see in his works there's a lot of different countries, different cultures coming together. He researched this novel in India. He visited lots of different places. And you'll see that a lot of this novel seems autobiographical. But I want to keep reminding you that it's fiction. And the reason for this, it is a novel about a shipwreck. And one year I taught it, as I always do, and a student thought that it was honestly a nonfiction piece. Now, this course is called AP Literature, so we're not allowed to read nonfiction. So he was super disappointed when he found out it was fiction because it's an amazing story. Everything that happens in it is plausible and possible. Although, like any survival at sea stories, it's a little bit far fetched. But it is fiction. I just want to say that from the start. So the plot, it's spoiled from the beginning. It's a shipwreck story. The narrator's name is Pi. His full name is Pisin Molitar Patel, and he survives the shipwreck. And the reason we know this is he's telling the story. So the author intentionally has ruined it from the start in terms of spoilers. He's 16 years old for most of the story. He and his family decide to move away from Pondicherry, India, where they own a zoo. There's some political upheaval, and they're going to Canada. They're transporting some of the animals, which they managed to sell. So he's on a boat, kind of like Noah's Ark. He's on a boat. It's actually a cargo ship headed to Canada with a bunch of different animals. So, as I said, he lives in Pondicherry, India, and there's 3 different religions that he encounters when he lives there. And you'll notice in part 1, which is this week's reading assignment, he decides to take on 3 different religions simultaneously. So he wants to be a member of 3 different religions. As I mentioned, there's political upheaval, and that's what causes him to leave. So the setting for part 1 is in India. Part 1, plot-wise, I admit it's the slowest of the 3 parts. Any good shipwreck story, you need to know something about the person before they get stuck at sea. So stick with it. The things that are being set up in part 1 is what gives the story its meaning. If we only had part 2 and part 3, the story would not be something that we'd read in AP Literature. It's putting the 3 pieces together that gives it meaning. So the way this will work is I'll discuss at the end of each, or at the beginning of each week, I'll discuss the last week's reading and give you some ideas about what they mean, but you honestly can't understand the deeper meaning of the novel until you finish it all. So part 1 is a little bit slow. There's some background on the character. We get to know him. Part 2 and part 3 take place on the ocean during the shipwreck. So plot-wise, parts 2 and 3 are more exciting. So the main character is Pi. There's some animal characters as well. There's Richard Parker, who's a very big Bengal tiger. There's a bunch of other animals like a zebra, a hyena, an orangutan, some meerkats, possibly some other human characters. His family appears on the ship before the shipwreck, on the cargo ship. We can't talk about the characters in detail until you read part 3. So the structure, as I mentioned, part 1, it focuses on his thoughts on religion and his thoughts on life at the zoo. You do need to read part 1 and understand it before you can make sense of parts 2 and 3. Part 2, it's super easy, it's fast, you kind of want to get through it. It's the story of survival. It's an interesting shipwreck story. Most of it is straightforward, but some of it is a little bit strange, possibly symbolic. So you'll have 1 week to read part 1, you'll have 2 weeks to read part 2. Part 2 is the bulk of the novel, and then part 3 is super short. You could read it in 1 sitting for sure. And it's the very short story of his rescue, but it is important. So author is character, and this is where that one student 1 year got confused. So again, this is a work of fiction. The author, Jan Martel, is not the author who's a character in the novel. If anyone has seen the movie, there's an author who plays a role. He's a character who goes to Pi's house when Pi is an adult and interviews him. So there is an author as a character, and the italicized passages in the book, and I'm not sure on some of the PDFs the italics didn't come through, but on the passages where the author is describing Pi, like I went to Pi's house and he has all kinds of spices in his cabinet, he's got food squirreled away in his pantry and things like that. That's the author, but it's not Jan Martel. It's a character who's an author, and in this frame story, kind of like Their Eyes Are Watching God was a frame story, in this frame story, the fictional author is interviewing Pi to try to put together the story of his shipwreck. So the fictional author is a character, and he adds another layer of meaning that we'll talk about at the end of the novel. So again, it is fiction. Everything in it, it's possible, if not plausible. Even the far out things that happen, I mean, really, any shipwreck story, any survival story, there's going to be things that happen that are bizarre. I'm reading the nonfiction book Kon-Tiki, which is about I think it was 1940s, an explorer was trying to prove that it was possible that people from Peru could build a raft and drift on the currents and wind to the Polynesian islands. And so it's a true account. The reason I'm actually reading it is my dad read The Life of Pi, and he told me that Kon-Tiki reminded him of Life of Pi. And in Kon-Tiki, there are things that the sailors encounter, these 6 people who are on this raft. For example, they are asleep and this like snake fish with like really sharp teeth just lands in their cabin on the raft. And it was an animal that no human had recorded. They'd only found bones and fossils of it. They hadn't actually found a live one until this expedition. So, and this is nonfiction. So in any kind of nonfiction survival story, there are going to be things that don't sound plausible. So the author makes sure that everything in this fictional account is plausible, even if it doesn't seem likely. But again, it is fiction. It's structured as a realistic narrative with that fictional author to make it seem more authentic. And its meaning, we can't really talk about its meaning until you have read all 3 parts. And the reason for that is the author intentionally structured the story so that you cannot, for a little bit you can check out and just kind of watch it as a story play out in your mind. But at some point the author forces you to become an active participant in the story. And so you yourself as the reader are bringing meaning to the story. So the deeper meaning we will talk about. But Pi, he lives for religion. He's a Hindu at first, and then he wants to become a Christian and a Muslim, but he still remains Hindu while also being the other two. Obviously, he's a walking contradiction. He believes there's one truth to the world, but he thinks there's multiple ways of arriving at that same truth. So you want to think about what elements of the novel might be read as an allegory, and we'll talk more about this when you've gotten through part 3. So the dates, part 1, it's the kind of pre-story before he gets on the shipwreck. That's due next week, so you have a week to read it. Part 2, you'll have 2 weeks because it's the bulk of the book. And then part 3, super short, it'll be due May 27th. I will give you each week a passage analysis. This week it's just a so what chart, but it'll help you get some deeper understanding of the novel and the meaning. And on the day when reading is due, I'll post notes or a video to go over relevant parts of that section. But again, I can't make complete sense of it for you or with you until you've read all 3 parts. The last 2 weeks of school, once you've read all 3 parts, we'll be spending some time on our discussion forums, making sense of the work. The plan originally is to end the year with a Socratic seminar, and this was going to be kind of our capstone Socratic seminar. So the more of you participate on this, on these forums, the more lively the discussion will be. So something I want you to think about is what gives your life meaning. And it's kind of a strange situation that we're all relatively stuck at home, and things that we expected to happen are not happening anymore. It kind of does give us time to stop and think. So Meursault, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, characters like that, in this existentialism unit, they have found meaning in nothing. Hamlet kind of struggled with this. He searched for meaning in his religion. It was the only reason that he kind of stuck on the, I want to say righteous path, but obviously there's an asterisk there, but the more righteous path compared to what he could have done from the start. But they really don't find meaning in much. Pi is the opposite. He finds meaning in basically everything. So the reason I end the year on this novel, it's a very positive novel. It has a happy ending, even though he's on a shipwreck and people do get lost at sea. It's a very uplifting ending. So I wanted to end the year with something uplifting. The passage analysis for this week is chapter 4, and he describes the zoo where he lives, and I want you to look at the language. Imagine if you grew up in a zoo. Would you like it, or would it be disgusting, or distracting, or loud, or smelly? So look at the way that he describes a zoo, and then look for the tone shift at the end. If you're taking the AP exam, this type of passage analysis will help you on the one question that they have now for the abbreviated AP exam. So there are some notes on these slides. I put a couple of these already in the so what chart, and then just the so what part is empty for you to fill out. But loaded language, imagery, and description, metaphor is built in with all these, and there is that tone shift. Look at personification and also the term anthropomorphism, a fancy way of saying giving human qualities to animals. So similar to personification. Asyndeton or polysyndeton, putting lots of commas there or lots of coordinating conjunctions. Look for paradox. Look at the style of the language and not just what it says. So just some examples, metaphor and loaded language. He describes the zoo as a paradise, a palace. He compares himself to a prince with all these animals at his disposal. Lots of colors, just lists of animals. The connotation of all this is amazing. He loves the zoo. He finds meaning in everything. He looks at animals and he thinks that they have souls and they have feelings and things like that. There's language that has religious connotations, but he's just describing a zoo and animals. He says things like language founders in such seas. He's foreshadowing a shipwreck, but language foundering, he's basically saying that he cannot express in words what he's trying to express. And that idea is very important to understand the overall meaning of the book. So language is unable to capture this truth that he's trying to convey. And think about religion. So he has 3 different religions, and anyone who strongly believes in any religion can understand that most religions ask you to commit to one of them, right? They're saying, we have the correct ideas, other people don't have it right necessarily. Pi doesn't think that's true. He thinks that language founders. So each religion is built on language, and it's trying to use language to explain truths. But what he's saying is that there are no words that can fully express a truth in life. And so he likes stories. Stories are ways to try to explain a truth, but language can never fully explain the ideas behind it. So he does use things like perform their rites, witness, grace, the perfection of a seal. All the words he uses in this passage have some religious undertones, and they do prepare the reader for the tone shift at the end. He uses the word nonsense. It's like a slap in the face. Think about the new tone. He has this idea of zoo. So think about a zoo. Is a zoo like a prison for animals, or is it something else? How do you feel about being trapped in your home? Is it a prison, or is it something else? I've seen advice floating around social media. You're not trapped at home, you're safe at home. This passage has the same ideas for animals. He is asserting they're not trapped in a zoo, they're safe in a zoo. And he's basically saying that this idea contradicts what most people think about zoos, but he's asserting that he's right and other people are not. Alright, so if you have any questions, please send me an email. Let me know if you're having trouble accessing a PDF or a copy of the novel, and I will see you next week.